Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. Something you may not know about me is that I'm a news junkie, and I tend to watch the news very closely. I get it from a number of different sources, both liberal and conservative, because I figure the truth lies probably somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. Um, and one of the things you find out from being a news junkie is that things ain't all that great out there. It doesn't take long to figure out that most people are disheartened and are upset with what they see and what they hear. We go to the grocery store, and our groceries are 25 to 30% higher than what we were paying a couple of years ago. Gas prices are not where we want them to be. Houses are not selling, and what is selling is high interest rates. And the list goes on and on and on. We can find a lot of things to be upset about. We can get involved in politics, and if we're Republicans, we're upset because of the way the media is treating Trump. If we're Democrats, we're upset because of the way the media is treating Biden or the way the Republicans are treating Biden. There's always something to be upset about. Let me take you back in time for a bit. We're going back 1900 and some odd years ago. There's an old man sitting in either a dingy house or a dingy cell, certainly not central heat and central air. He's chained to soldiers on both sides. He's given his life to Jesus, and now he's in prison. Not only is he in prison, the odds are not real good in his favor about ever getting released. He's writing a letter. If it were me, I'd be writing a letter to God. God, get me out of here. God, how could you let this happen to me? I've done all the things I've done for you, God, and you give me this? Of course, I'm talking about the Apostle Paul. Towards the end of his life, we know that he was imprisoned by the Romans, and history tells us that he was eventually beheaded for his faith. But the letter he was writing was not a letter to God. It was a letter to a group of people in a church that he had helped plant, the church in Philippi. And as Paul is writing from this dark, dimly lit room, whether it's in a dungeon or a prison or a home, because we know he was under home arrest for a while. But as he's writing Philippians, we know that he's in chains. He's writing by the light of a candle with probably a quill feather with ink or on papyrus. Not a good situation to be in. And he writes to the Philippian church. He writes such things as his expectation of deliverance, the fact that we should rejoice in suffering. Now, there's a new concept that as believers we will suffer, and we should learn to rejoice in suffering. In fact, it is a rejoicing in that suffering that Paul says will bring us blessings. He goes on to say, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of Christ. I want to experience that resurrection power of Christ. And then he goes on to say, and to join with him in his sufferings. Wow, that's a powerful statement. Paul understood that in the midst of suffering comes, that power and authority comes from being willing to join with Christ in suffering. But there's another component that he shares with the Philippians. In chapter 3, verse 1, he says, finally, my brethren, after you've gone through all the things that are going on, he says, rejoice in the Lord. It's no trouble to write to you about these same things again. In other words, he's reminding them to rejoice. Now, again, this is Paul. This is Paul in prison. And he's saying, rejoice. Rejoice. And then over in chapter 4, he says this. Chapter 4, verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I will say it again, rejoice. I don't always rejoice. I get upset. I complain. I gripe. I get unhappy. And sometimes I want to shake my fist at God and say, don't you understand? And I hear that still small voice of his spirit saying, oh yes, I understand. Because I'm living it with you. Now, don't you understand what you need to do about it? And I go back to Paul's admonition to the Philippians. Rejoice always. In every situation, rejoice. In Ephesians, he says, give thanks in all circumstances. He doesn't say give thanks for those circumstances. He says give thanks in those circumstances. In other words, we rejoice in God's presence. We give him thanks for that presence in the crisis. That's what Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego did in that fiery furnace. They worshiped God in the midst of the fire, and God showed up. Imagine Daniel thrown in the lion's den. And we think of that, he was thrown in a cave and a stone was rolled in front. What they probably had was a cave of lions that's been blocked up in the front. They can't get out. They've not been fed for several days. They're hungry. And then the captive that's to be thrown down is thrown in through a hole in the top of the cave, and then a rock rolled over it. So Daniel is stuck in there. And he's been trusting God. And despite all the trust he's put in God, now he finds himself in the lion's den. What did he say? We don't know. Scripture is silent. Well, not as silent as you might think. Because the next day the king comes with all the faith that he has and says, Daniel, are you still alive? And Daniel says, O king, live forever. My God, the God I serve, shut the mouths of these hungry lions. And yes, I am still alive. Bless God forevermore. I think, my opinion, during the night, Daniel started worshiping. He started honoring God. In fact, I suspect on the way down from the top of that cave before he ever hit the ground, he was certainly praying. I suspect he was worshiping because he had learned the power of worship despite what the culture said, despite what the king said, despite what the law said. He had learned to worship his Father, Yahweh. And instead of hungry lions, he found himself in the midst of a bunch of overgrown pussycats who left him alone all night long. Maybe they cuddled up and kept him warm at night while he slept, and he scratched him behind the ears. I don't know. But I know Daniel came out of that event alive, worshiping all the more. Paul, I believe, worshiped up until the day they took his head off. I suspect his last words were not, how could you do this to me? I suspect his last words were, get my mansion ready, I'm on my way, Father. So my last thought for you tonight is this. I don't know what you're going through. I know circumstances in our culture are not great, and other countries have it even worse. But our Father's treasury has not been depleted. He still owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he still calls us to walk in joy as we wait to see what he's going to do as he intervenes in our lives. And he will. So with that thought, I'll leave you, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week back in the Pastor Study.